I'm Bill with TANDEMKROSS, making good guns great. Before I get started, let me ask you to please like and share this video on whatever social media platform you found it on. Follow us if you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, Parler, and MeWe. And if you're watching on YouTube, please click subscribe and the notification bell so that whenever we upload a new video, you'll find out right away. Now let's get down to business. After much hinting and teasing, we've finally released the most exciting TANDEMKROSS product to date, the Kraken. The Kraken is a lower for Ruger Mark IV 2245. It's compatible with all factory Mark IV and Mark IV 2245 uppers and the vast majority of aftermarket Mark IV and Mark IV 2245 uppers. It's made from aerospace grade aluminum, so it resists heat, corrosion, and users accidentally ripping out the thread inserts. But the material it's made from isn't the only difference. The design of the lower is quite a bit different from the factory version also. One noticeable difference is the larger squared off trigger guard that makes wrapping your hand around the front of it or shooting with gloves on easier. The lower's center of gravity is shifted too to help manage muzzle rise for better grip and control. But the most significant change is the use of a takedown screw rather than a takedown button. Now you might be wondering, why make takedown harder when the fact that it was so easy was the whole point? But a screw holds the upper and the lower together much more tightly than the button mechanism does, improving the interface between them and making your pistol shoot more reliably. The thing is, the Kraken lower is just the lower. It doesn't come loaded with internals. You have to take them out of an existing Mark IV 2245 or assemble them from various sources and install them into the Kraken yourself. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do in this video. Now it can be a long and challenging process, so I recommend watching the video all the way through once and then going back and following along as you do your own install. But if you take your time, if you're patient and careful, I am 100% sure that you can do it yourself. Here we go. To do this install, you will need a 3/32 and 1/16 Allen wrench. We supply those with the Kraken. You will also need a 3/32 or smaller punch and a hammer, and a punch block might be helpful. Needle nose pliers, and we strongly recommend eye protection because some parts are under spring pressure. As always, your first step is to make sure that your pistol is clear and safe. If it is, you can make sure that your safety is set to safe, press the takedown button, and rotate the upper off of the lower. You won't need it again until the very end, so you can set the upper aside. Now, grab an empty magazine if you still have your mag disconnect installed. Make sure your safety is set to fire, and then very carefully let the hammer down by pulling the trigger. Eject the mag. And now remove the grip panels. When you remove the left side panel, you can also remove the bolt stop lever. Now your next step is still with the 3/32 Allen wrench to remove the frame lug screw. With that screw out, now the frame lug itself can come out. That's this piece right here in front of the trigger. It's in there pretty tight, so you'll have to grab it and wiggle it quite a bit to get it to loosen up. But once it's loose, it will come out and you can set that aside. Now grab your 1/16 Allen wrench and remove the right side safety paddle. Take that screw out and take the paddle off and set them both aside. Underneath that lever is the right side of the safety lever shaft that goes all the way through the frame. You'll probably have to use your punch and the punch block to get this started because you have to remove the safety lever. So lightly tap on that, the end of that shaft. Once the safety lever starts protruding a little bit from the other side, you can pull it out by hand. Now you'll probably want to put your thumb or your hand over the top of the hammer to prevent the spring-loaded parts in here from jumping out. But then you can carefully pull out the safety lever. This whole hammer assembly, which you should leave intact and not try to take apart. And the safety plate. When you take the safety lever out, be sure not to lose the spring and detent that live in the back of it here. They will often stay in the safety lever without falling out, but it's possible for them to fall out when you remove it, so just be careful. Keep track of where that spring and detent is. Next, we will be removing the sear retaining pin and the sear itself and the sear spring. So use your punch to push out that retaining pin. When you pull the pin out, the sear and sear spring will come loose. The sear will likely just fall out the bottom of the lower. The spring might as well, or you might have to kind of fish it out of the gun. The next thing to come out will be the trigger retaining pin. This trigger pin is currently retained by this thin wire along the right side of the gun, which you can just barely see the tip of on the right side of the trigger. To get the trigger pin out, you are going to have to use one of your thin tools, either an Allen wrench or your punch. I find this 1/16 Allen wrench works quite well to depress the tip of that wire. Then you can use one of your other tools, I prefer to use the punch, to punch out the trigger pin. As you remove this trigger retaining pin, try to keep the pistol frame upright. There's a lot of small parts in this assembly that are easy to lose. I also recommend keeping a finger, like I'm doing, over the top of the trigger to prevent the spring pressure from ejecting those small parts. Once the pin's out though, you can pull out the trigger and trigger bar. Be very careful when taking this out because there's a spring and detent in the top of the trigger that you don't want to lose. Then remove the bolt stop. You may have to wiggle that around and rotate it around a little bit to get it to come free of the frame. Underneath the bolt stop, there is a tiny little spring. This bolt stop spring is extremely easy to lose, so keep an eye on that one too. The next step is to remove the mag disconnect. And to do that, you have to loosen up this long wire here. You pressed it down before with the 1/16 Allen wrench. Now you have to pull it up with the 1/16 Allen wrench. Pulling it up lets you take it out, and it also frees up the mag release button to be taken out. Now when you take out the mag release button, there is a tiny little spring and detent on this as well. Again, don't lose it. Keep an eye on it and set those aside. On the bottom of the frame, there's this mag release helper plunger. And this retaining pin right here, that keeps it in. If you kind of block that plunger from jumping out, it probably won't, but it's possible. It is under spring pressure. And then punch that pin out. This pin can be quite stiff. You may be able to do it without the punch block and hammer, but you might need the hammer to tap it out. And now you can set that pin and the plunger. and the plunger's spring aside. The last step of the disassembly is to remove this big bolt stop pin here. And it's held in place by this smaller pin. So you will have to punch that pin out. This pin can also be quite stiff. But once it's out, you can remove the big bolt stop pin. Be careful not to lose the takedown button or the pin that you just punched out. You can actually put that pin back in your stock lower. You won't be needing it for the Kraken, but it helps to hold the takedown button and its upper grabbing mechanism together. But once it's back in, I'm just gonna tap it the rest of the way in here. It's quite stiff going back in too. But with that, you are done disassembling your factory lower. Now it's time to assemble the Kraken. Before we start though, I just want to point out a few key things about the Kraken. First of all, I want you to notice that it is manufactured in two halves. You can actually see the seam if you look along the back and along the front here. We do not recommend trying to take it apart, just leave it together. You'll also notice the takedown screw that I mentioned previously. It will likely be protruding slightly from the gun when you get it. That's normal, and you will screw it all the way in later. And then lastly is this sear retaining hole. This is something we added to help make installing the sear, which is notoriously difficult, much easier. And I'll explain that when I get to it. But first, let's do the easy things. You're going to use your 3/32 Allen wrench to reinstall the frame lug and frame lug screw. That just sets right into the exact same spot that it was on your stock lower. Make sure that that's in there securely, and then we will reinstall this mag release helper plunger. So grab the larger of those spring and detents, and the pin. Put the spring in the hole on the bottom of the grip first. When you go to insert the plunger, you'll want to make sure that it's oriented correctly. There's a flat side of it. That flat side is going to be facing towards the rear of the gun, and the flattened half of it will be pointing down. Once that's in place, depress it slightly and put the pin through the frame to hold it in place. Next, you'll want to grab your sear, your sear spring, and the sear retaining pin. Before we get too far into this, it's good to take a close look at your sear and just make sure that you understand how it's going to work. on the sear, you have this cutout in the middle of it. That is where the sear spring will go. Like so. The sear itself is oriented so that the longer end is facing forward for now, and that cutout is facing towards the left side of the frame. So here's how I normally would do this. I would grab the sear with my needle nose pliers. Oriented like I showed you just a moment ago, insert it into the frame, down low enough that the hole through the sear lines up with the retaining pin hole through the frame, and then from right to left, slide that sear pin in. Now this can be a little fussy. And what you want to do is only slide the sear pin in just enough to hold the sear in place. You don't want to slide it all the way through because, as shown here, you need to still have space between the sear and the left side of the frame for that sear spring to slide in. So now I'm just going to hold the sear pin in place and show you how the sear spring is going to be aligned. The sear spring is going to sit as shown within the frame, with the short leg of the spring pointing up, like this, and the long leg of the spring pointing down, and it will be visible in that window there on the frame. So now grab your sear spring with those needle nose pliers. Insert it down into the frame, making sure that it gets into that space in the sear, that cutout in the sear. You'll want to make sure that the sear is relatively flat so that the leg of the spring, the short leg of the spring, ends up in front of what will be the top portion of the sear. And you'll also want to make sure that the long leg of the spring gets down into that window. Make sure that long leg is in the window before you try to put the pin all the way through, because otherwise you will not be able to get it in there once the pin is in. So now the sear spring is fully installed, the sear retaining pin is pushed all the way through, and if I try to pull the sear forward, rotate it forward, the spring provides resistance and pushes it backwards. That's how you know that the spring and the sear are installed correctly. Now, going back to our sear retaining hole that I mentioned before, your 1/16 Allen wrench is what will go into that hole to hold the sear rotated forward. So you'll want to grab the back of the sear, pull it forward, and then insert that Allen wrench into the retaining hole. And once it's in, if you look, you'll see that the sear is tipped forward and held in place by that pin, prevented from rotating back. All right, our next step is going to be to install the magazine release. So grab that long wire from before, and also grab your mag release button and the little spring and detent that go into the button. This spring, as you can see, kind of resembles the shape of the lower a little bit. It's got this long upper part. That's what you pressed down on before to release the trigger retaining pin. And then it has this lower part that angles out. The tip of that lower part is going to go from the inside of the frame into this hole just below the magazine release. So insert that in carefully and get that little turned out end of the spring into that hole. And rotate it down into place. And then grab your magazine release. Make sure your spring and detent is in it. And then insert it from the left side towards the right side and rotate it so that the half moon shaped end of the mag release is aligned with the half moon shaped hole on the right side of the frame. Now to get it to go all the way in, you will have to move this wire out of the way and then push it back down to keep that button in place. So now you can see that that wire's in place, the magazine button is retained. So now we can install our bolt stop and bolt stop spring. The bolt stop will be lined up inside the frame as shown, with the hole through it lined up with the hole for the trigger retaining pin and the stud lined up with that hole in the middle of the frame. But first you have to put the spring into place. The spring sits in this tiny hole just behind the frame lug on the left side of the frame. So drop that into place. From here on out, you're going to want to try to keep the frame as upright as possible so that that doesn't fall out. But then you can put that stud on the bolt stop through the stud hole and then rotate it down into place. So the end of the bolt stop is going to be resting on top of the spring. Now I'm going to grab my trigger and trigger bar and the retaining pin. One side of the trigger has a countersunk hole on it. This one right here, that's what the stud on the end of the trigger bar goes into. And it will look like this once it's inserted. So with that assembled, what you'll want to do is take a look at your pin. You'll see there's a notch on one end of it. You will be putting this trigger pin into the frame from left to right so that that notched end is on the right. So make sure that your bolt stop is up against the left side of the frame, and then slide the trigger and trigger bar down into place. So now you'll insert the pin as I described before so that it goes through the hole in both the bolt stop and the trigger. It will not be going all the way through just yet. This can still take a little bit of jostling around because you have to get that pin to go through the hole in both parts. But once everything is aligned, you will feel that pin push most of the way through. Once it's most of the way through, it'll be up against that wire from before. Just like when we removed the trigger, you will also have to push the wire down to fully install the trigger. So grab your punch or your Allen wrench, depress that wire, and push the pin all the way through. All right. Next, we will be installing the hammer and safety. So start with the safety plate, which will be aligned as shown within the frame up against the left side of the frame. It sits there with that hooked end of it around the top of the sear. So you can just drop that in. And then grab your safety lever. I think that now is a good time to install that little spring and detent into the hole on the back stud of the safety lever. Like I mentioned before, they tend to stay in there pretty well. You will still want to be careful, make sure that you don't lose it, but you can put them in and be reasonably assured at this point that they won't just fall out. So now you'll want to put the long strut of that safety lever into the frame and through the safety plate, but not all the way through to the other side of the frame yet. Just enough to hold the safety plate in place. So now's the time to grab your trigger spring and detent. Put the spring and then the detent into the top of the trigger. And just as a reminder, try to keep the frame upright still so that those detents don't fall out. But now you can grab your hammer assembly here. That spring leg is going to go down into the window on the right side of the frame. And the other parts of this hammer assembly are going to be oriented as shown, with the mag disconnect pointing forward, the hammer pointing up, and the hammer strut pointing down. The bushing is going to go into that hole on the end of the trigger bar. So you'll have to kind of put them together and then swing the trigger bar down and work all of those little parts around so that they fall into place correctly. Sometimes it's easier to get the leg of that wire spring into the window first and then bring the trigger bar down and connect it to the bushing. But once everything is down and in place, you can start pushing the safety lever the rest of the way into the frame. Before you can push it all the way into the frame, you'll want to make sure that that spring and detent are safely in place in the back of the safety lever. You'll also have to make sure that the safety plate is aligned correctly. It can drop down easily, and so I find that using the Allen wrench to pull it up so that that cutout in the back of it can go around the stud, the rear stud of the safety plate. This can definitely take a little bit of finagling. It can be helpful both to rotate the safety plate with the Allen wrench and to try shifting the safety lever itself around. But this I find actually to be possibly the hardest part of getting the hammer installed, is getting the safety lever and the safety plate to align correctly. But once they're aligned correctly, you can push that lever all the way in so that it's up against the left side of the frame, and the end of that long stud that goes through the frame is flush with the right side. So now it's safe to pull that 1/16 Allen wrench out. The sear doesn't need to be retained anymore. And the hard part's over. Check the function of the safety, make sure that it still moves up and down and clicks like it's supposed to. Now we have to caulk the hammer, but it's common for the hammer strut to not be aligned with the mainspring correctly. The hammer is rotated quite far forward here. That's pretty common when you install the hammer for it to end up like that. So to fix that and make sure that the strut is aligned correctly, I just push the hammer back a little bit and then push the strut down with the punch. Down in towards the gun, towards the mainspring, so that it lines up correctly. Now, if you still have your mag disconnect installed, you will need a magazine, but insert your magazine and caulk the hammer. Now, one thing to keep in mind, with the mag inserted and without the grip panels to hold it in, that retaining pin for the mag release helper plunger can actually drop out pretty easily. So just, keep an eye on that. Don't let it fall out. But now if your hammer can caulk back and with your safety set to fire, if you can pull the trigger and the hammer comes down, remember not to let it just slam down without the upper on. But if your trigger works and your hammer can caulk back, then that means that your sear and your hammer and your trigger and your safety are all installed correctly. So you can eject that mag. So now grab your 3/32 Allen wrench and your big bolt stop pin. Use the Allen wrench to unscrew this rearmost screw here in the frame. And then let's take a close look at our bolt stop pin for a moment. If you look at it, you'll see that it has this flattened cutout in it. That cutout has to be facing forward when you set it into the frame. But you can set it in, and you can replace that screw that you just took out, and that will hold the big bolt stop pin in. It will still have a little bit of play. That's normal. That's fine. All right, we're almost there at this point. You'll want to cock the hammer back one last time. Make sure that your safety is set to safe. Eject the mag. Replace the bolt stop lever. And replace your left side grip panel. Flip the Kraken over and replace the right side safety lever with that little screw in your 1/16 Allen wrench. And then you can replace the right side grip panel. And now our lower assembly is complete. So all we have to do is put the upper on. Putting the upper on starts out just like it normally would. Make sure your bolt is fully inserted. Put the front notch in the upper onto the frame lug and rotate it down over that big bolt stop pin. Make sure your safety is on safe. Press the upper all the way down, and then while applying downward pressure, use the 3/32 Allen wrench to screw in the takedown screw. You'll want to screw it in until it's almost flush with the frame. One thing to be careful of is if you over tighten it, the safety may not work correctly. So check that your safety works and that it can still move. But if it does, if everything seems tight and together, then I'd check functions one last time. Your bolt, your bolt lock lever, your mag release, your trigger and safety. But if everything seems like it's working correctly, then you are finally done. Congratulations on your new Kraken from TANDEMKROSS. One last thing to keep in mind while you're planning your build. While the Kraken is compatible with all factory non-2245 Mark IV uppers, it's not compatible with all factory non-2245 Mark IV lower parts. Only the parts shown here from a Mark IV stock lower are compatible with the Kraken. All other parts will have to be replaced. And as a note, not all aftermarket parts are necessarily going to work with the Kraken. Please contact TANDEMKROSS customer service for more details about specific parts. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or suggestions about this video, be sure to let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that whenever we upload a new video, you'll find out right away. You can also find us elsewhere on the internet like Facebook, Instagram, Parler, and MeWe. And of course, you can find all of our products at www.tandemkross.com.